And welcome to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. I'm Richard Arenberg, professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute. Welcome to the many Brown students, faculty, alumni, and other interested citizens joining us virtually this evening. The Taubman Center seeks to influence American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. The Taubman Center for several years has focused its efforts on three themes: the pursuit of security, the cost of living, and challenges to our democracy in America. This year, we're placing special emphasis on the national elections and the consequences as the nation grapples with issues of social justice, public health, education, the economy, and the commitment to the rule of law, with a roster of outstanding speakers and programs. Tonight, we present the 11th in our series of events. We're honored to have as our guest former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Evelyn Farkas. Our moderator this evening is my colleague, Brian Atwood. And this is a special occasion for me because both Evelyn and Brian are longtime friends dating back to my history on Capitol Hill. Brian is a visiting scholar in international and public affairs at the Watson Institute here at Brown and professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He served as chair of the Global Policy Studies and professor of public policy at the Humphrey School from 2012 to 2015. He was dean of the Humphrey School from 2002 to 2010 and was elected president of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs in 2009. He was also the chair of the University of Minnesota's Dean's Council and a recipient of the university's Distinguished Service Award. From 2010 to 2012, Brian was a member elected, chair of the Development Assistance Committee of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Atwood led the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, during the administration of President Bill Clinton. He earlier had led the Clinton-Gore transition team when we used to have transitions at the State Department in 1992 and was Undersecretary of State for Management. He received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award in 1999. During the Carter administration, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Relations. In 2001, he served on the UN Secretary General's panel on peace operations. He was a legislative advisor to Senator Tom Eagleton from 1972 to 1977, and he was the first president of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs from 86 to 93. He was a career diplomat before joining Senator Eagleton and later became Dean of Professional Studies and Academic Affairs at the Foreign Service Institute. He currently is chair of the Population Service International Board, vice chair of AFS Intercultural Programs Board, and a member of the board of the National Democratic Institute and of the Watson Institute Board of Overseers. and one more accomplishment, and I probably would have fallen out of my chair here. Our featured guest
I'm feeling
tonight,
really small.
you've got a pretty long list yourself. Our featured guest tonight is Dr. Evelyn Farkas. She has 3 decades of experience working on national security and foreign policy in the executive and legislative branches of government, the private sector, and for international organizations overseas. In 2019 to 2020, she ran to represent New York's 17th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. She's currently president of Farkas Global Strategies. Prior to that, she was senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Atlantic Council and National Security contributor for NBC and MSNBC. Prior to that, she was she served from 2012 to 2015 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, the Balkans, and Conventional Arms Control. From 2010 to 2012, she was Senior Advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Special Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for the NATO Summit. Prior to that, she was Executive Director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism, and Senior Fellow at the American Security Project. From 2001 to 2008, she served as a professional staff member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. From 1997 to 2001, Evelyn was a professor of international relations at the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College. She served from 1996 to 97 in Bosnia with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and she published numerous journal articles and opinion pieces. She earned her MA and PhD degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the Board of Trustees of Franklin and Marshall College. Following Professor Atwood's conversation with Dr. Farkas, she will take questions from our audience. You may enter questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, which will be viewable to the moderator. You can begin entering questions if you have them already, beginning now and throughout the program. Please keep them short and to the point. Professor Atwood will convey as many of these questions to our guests as we have time for. This event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website, and is being live streamed on YouTube. So without any further delay, I will turn the mic over to our moderator, Professor Brian Atwood.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. It was a pleasure, by the way, to work with Rich Ehrenberg when he was in the U.S. Senate, and that was the day when the Senate used to actually adopt legislation on occasion. George Mitchell, I think, was one of your bosses, but good man. Evelyn, thanks so much for doing this. You honor the Watson Institute for coming here today. You've got such an impressive national security background, and the right person to talk about the legacy of the last 4 years. That's a kind of there's so much to talk about. But I wanted to start because, and I think I've told you this, I communicated briefly with Evelyn. She gave me permission to call her Evelyn. She said that only her opponents have to call her Dr. Farkas. But
Political opponents.
Political opponents, yes. And I said, I'm not an opponent, I'm an admirer. So I want to start by asking you about that experience. I mean, you've spent a career in working on national security issues and foreign policy, the Department of Defense, and teaching the subject and the like. But what's it like to get into the political arena? And I ask that because there are a lot of people probably watching here, Brown students and others, that may be even contemplating a career or getting into politics. It's encouraging to see so many women in particular getting into politics and running. What was that experience like? You ran in a multi-candidate race for a seat held by Nita Lowey, who was someone that I admired greatly and was always supportive of USAID. What was it like? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, let me just say thank you to Rich Ehrenberg, to the Taubman Center, to you, Brian, to Samantha Griffin, for organizing this event and for honoring me by inviting me to have a conversation with all of you this evening. Yes, as you said, I am a foreign policy wonk expert, what have you, practitioner, and I found myself suddenly confronting issues in the United States that I was used to grappling with overseas. And what I mean by that, of course, is the existential questions about democracy. And I became so concerned, starting, of course, with Russia and Russia's impact on the United States, Russia's foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States, which it was executing, unfortunately, very successfully, weakening our democracy, getting us to fight one another, and then, of course, interfering in our elections. And then once Donald Trump was elected, I saw internally a real crisis in our democracy. And so I thought to myself, well, what happens if Donald Trump gets another term? And to my mind, I felt that that would endanger democracy. And so I resolved that I would get involved in politics. Now, I told several of my friends this, including New York friends in New York. And around that time, Nita Lowey announced that she was retiring. And as you said, she'd been 30 years our congresswoman. She broke the glass ceiling, frankly. I mean, there were some other female House of Representative members, but I don't believe that our district had one. In any event, she not only broke the ceiling or was one of many women who broke the ceiling into the House at the time, but she also right now is the chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, the first female to hold that position. Mm-hmm. I was basically pushed to run. I will say I was convinced to run. It wasn't something that I necessarily had, like I said, I hadn't aspired to it, but I have to step back for a minute because my parents are on this participating also. And my father's turning 95 on Thanksgiving Day. My mother's 82. They are refugees. They fled communist Hungary to come here to America in 1956 when the revolution against the Soviets failed in Hungary. And I was born here and raised here, but was basically raised in two worlds. And we even went back to Hungary and visited. I lived under communism, at least if you can call, living there for a summer or living under communism. I knew very much what it was like. And so I think I felt that this assault on our democracy was something personal. So that's why I ran. What was it like? I can't say, because honestly, I ran during a pandemic. The first couple months of the race, and we all got in relatively late, that was because Nita Lowey didn't announce she was retiring until October. Now, there was already someone, the guy who won, because if I won, maybe I would be busy not going to a dinner in the Capitol or something. But the guy who won had already challenged Nita Lowey 6 months before the rest of us got into the race. But as you mentioned, Brian, there were 8 of us in the race. And the rest of us jumped in, the 7, actually there were more than 8 before we got to the final ballot. But leaving that aside, the rest of us jumped in after Nita Lowey announced she was retiring. So we kind of took the respectful route. We were not going to challenge her. But the guy who won was already in there challenging her, which has something to do with his win, not everything though. In fact, I think he won because of the sympathy people had for Black Lives Matter. He's Black, he's young, he's also gay. And so that was what happened. We got in late. It was a rush. And so it was mid-November around this time. And most of us got in. And then what happened was we had the pandemic really in March. So it was a rush. And that part was fun because I was meeting a lot of people and I was doing a lot of public forums, although you can imagine with that many candidates, and at one time we had 13 on the dais, really long debates, where everyone had to have their turn. So it was sometimes tedious. It was exciting to meet people, but the pandemic part was really hard. And ultimately, I'll just finish with this. What's really wrong about it is how much money you have to raise. Now, I raised the most out of everyone until the very end, when after Black Lives Matter, in that aftermath, Alessandro Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and the groups rallied behind the guy who won in my race. So Mondaire Jones got their endorsement and their money. So $200,000 came in, and that was more than what I had raised. But up until that point, I had raised the most. There was also a guy whose family basically put in $5 million. So I roughly tied with him for second ultimately, if you round up and down to the nearest percentage.
It must have been quite an experience, a different experience than you've had in government, obviously. But so you put yourself out there, and I have to admire that. And I've had friends that have run, some have won, some have lost, but they always come back saying it kind of changed me. I had a different view of our democracy from that perspective. So I'm sure that's going to make you a much better public servant as time goes on, and I fully expect to see you in the Biden administration, so we shall see. Let's talk a little bit about the Trump legacy here, because that's what the title of this event is all about. I suspect, like me, you're troubled by a lot of the things that happened over time. Maybe we could start, I really want to get into Russia and Ukraine at some point, but let's start with NATO. He put a lot of pressure on our allies to get up to the 2% GDP. That was actually an agreement that was reached in the Obama administration. All of the NATO members agreed to do that. Now, not all of the NATO members can afford to do that, and the economic crisis that's hit Europe has really strained their resource base. The thing I think that is most troubling, and I'd like you to comment on this, is the comments that the president made when, for example, Montenegro joined, where he basically raised a question about Article 5, which is the commitment that if one is attacked, all are attacked. Tell me what the state of NATO is today, given the kind of pressure that Trump has put them under.
Yeah. So I will answer your question, but I want to say a few words, if you'll permit me, just about kind of how I perceive the Trump foreign policy, because the title of this talk is, Trump's foreign policy and his legacy. And I think it's important to step back just for 1 second and to recognize that Trump's foreign policy was a number of things. One, it was unconventional. It was unpredictable, it was confrontational, and it was America, frankly, alone. It wasn't just America first, it was America alone. And the consequence of all of that together meant that we had allies who no longer trusted us, okay? And that's still the case, we're gonna have to rebuild. We had a situation where we had failed to address weapons of mass destruction effectively. We have now put ourselves in greater danger. Iran looks like it's gone from 0 nuclear weapons at the end of the Obama administration to maybe the material for 12. We have North Korea also proceeding apace. We don't know the exact numbers, but what the experts think is that the material for 12 nuclear weapons is manufactured every year by North Korea. You can do the math. Under the Trump administration, we now are up to as many as perhaps 60 nuclear weapons. So material for 60 nuclear weapons in the hands of the North Koreans, not to mention all the missile tests that they've conducted, and also the tests of the nuclear weapons themselves. In addition to that, the instability in the Middle East, you can argue it many ways and we can have a conversation about it, but I believe that Donald Trump has increased the instability in the Middle East. And I had a long list here. And then I guess, frankly, the bottom line, of course, all of this now we see today is that we're very unprepared as a globe, as a country, but with our allies and partners and with the world. The world is, because of our foreign policy, I believe, really unprepared to deal with massive challenges like the global pandemic, like the climate crisis, and refugee flows. So those are kind of 3 things that I think are critical. Of course, the refugee flow is related to the environment and economic factors I didn't put in there. But the point is that that's the sum, that's the result. That is what the Trump foreign policy legacy is right now. Relating to NATO specifically, I'll try to be brief because I know I spoke at length about the other stuff. But the bottom line is that President Trump what he did was really weaken NATO as an alliance. We rely, you mentioned Article 5. Article 5 is the deterrent against Russia or any other adversaries from attacking any NATO member, either on its territory, in its air, in its sea, or in the cyber world. And if the Russians or any other adversaries think that our political will is weak or non-existent, and that's to say the political will of the entire alliance, which is as strong, frankly, as the weakest member, then those bad actors are emboldened to act against NATO. And what President Trump did by actually suggesting that the United States should withdraw from NATO, because we know that from people who told the media, who worked for him, and I have it from my own sources. By doing that, President Trump put into doubt whether we would go not just to the rescue of Montenegro, which is actually a country I'm very proud of Montenegro being in NATO, because myself and Vice President Biden at the time, we had a lot to do with that. It's another story, but not just Montenegro, but Poland. Although President Trump has this interesting relationship with Poland, but nevertheless, what he said about NATO and the way he acted towards the NATO alliance actually weakened it.
There's no question. I agree with you entirely. Most people listening may not be aware that the only time Article 5 was actually invoked was after 9/11, when we were attacked. And it was really, most of the European nations wanted to invoke Article 5, which, by the way, is why they're in Afghanistan today. And of course, part of having a relationship of trust is consulting with your allies when you make decisions. And the president has just made a decision, apparently, to withdraw 2,500 American troops from Afghanistan. I wonder whether he has actually consulted with the NATO alliance before he made that decision, and other decisions he's made. And maybe you could detail some of those decisions over the years.
Well, I suspect that he hasn't. And in that sense, it resembles, earlier this year when he, for the second time or the first time, I don't know, each time he said that we are going to withdraw from Syria, he has not consulted with the allies. He has not consulted with Congress. I mean, he's barely consulted with anyone inside the United States. Yet the allies, and in the case of Syria, there were French, and there were, and maybe there still are, I'm not sure, but French soldiers operating there in Syria, relying on the United States for their security, for basic enablers that we provide, intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities, cover for them, force protection. And these are the same types of things that the United States provides the NATO allies. Small countries like Croatia or Macedonia, they can't afford to spend money on satellites, which provide ultimately the intelligence for us to know whether an adversary is creeping up on our forces in Afghanistan. So we provide that for the NATO allies. Some of the larger countries, Germany, they have more capabilities, but still all of the NATO allies to some extent or another rely on us. The heavy lift capability is one that is, not replicated by any other NATO ally. So in making a decision unilaterally, we not only potentially put US troops in harm's way, as again, the president did when he made that decision about Syria, and possibly is doing so now in the case of Afghanistan, but we also potentially put allied troops in harm's way as well, without them having any say in the decision.
Yeah. Yeah, it's troubling. It really is. And I'm particularly troubled, having led the State Department transition back in the day, about this period we're in now, because we're very, very vulnerable during any transition period. And this is not the best case of a transition period. When I was a transition leader, we had to worry about Haiti, and we worried about Somalia at the time, but we were working with an administration in the George H.W. Bush administration that was being very cooperative and helpful. What are the dangers of not even agreeing to let some of our career people present their reports and information to the Biden transition team?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much danger. Number one, that some kind of threat comes out of nowhere, that the new administration is not prepared. So we saw that actually with 9/11, where the incoming administration, I'm trying to remember the exact timeline, but there was an August intelligence report. It was not really paid sufficient attention. That was, I guess, the outgoing administration under Bush, under Clinton. In any event, rather than worry about the timeline there.
It was the Clinton administration.
Yeah,
right.
but the main point is that, yeah, the Clinton administration. So the point is that I guess the new administration came in, they were also given briefings and warnings, but if you don't get the information as early as possible so that you can follow the trend line, you're in a worse situation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is knowing what the government is doing. How prepared is the government? What are the activities? How many troops do we have in X, Y, or Z place? That's why, for the COVID transition team, it's so important for them to know, what are they facing when they get into the job on day one? Do we have a plan for distribution of vaccines? What does it look like? What kind of emergency PPE storage facilities do we have? Where are they located? Does the Department of Defense have a plan, which of course was never activated under this Trump administration, but do they have a plan in an emergency to distribute PPE, to actually use the Defense Production Act to build ventilators and other equipment that might be needed? So without knowing that, they can't actually get prepared to put the documents in front of the president, the vice president, and other cabinet members to make decisions about spending money and taking action. And every day that you're not spending money and taking action is somebody sick in a hospital not getting what they need, So ultimately we're playing with people's lives. And of course, with national security, I don't need to tell you, Brian, we've got adversaries and they're all looking at the United States thinking a number of things. First of all, they're thinking, well, Donald Trump, we can tell he's kind of not switched off. And anyway, he likes me. If you're Vladimir Putin, you say to yourself. If you're Kim Jong-un, you say to yourself, so let me see, what can I get away with here, in the last couple of months before Biden comes in, because Biden's going to be tougher on me, right? But I can set up a fait accompli for the Biden team coming in that they won't be able to do anything about, right? I can deploy troops somewhere. I can do another nuclear test. Iran now, what they're doing, they're putting themselves in a position where they can negotiate from greater strength than if they hadn't geared up and created the material for 12 nuclear weapons, because they know that the Biden administration is going to come in and we have no choice. We have to put a clamp on Iran's nuclear activities. Any way you slice it and dice it. And the Trump administration has for 4 years let them go willy-nilly.
Yeah, I saw something the other day. They've gone from something like 200 kilograms, which they were allowed under the original agreement, to something over 2,000 now. So the breakout time is less than a year. So it's kind of urgent that we get back into that negotiation. How difficult will that be, given the sanctions regime that exists now that must be undone, I guess, by the Biden administration?
Right. And there are all the things, that you and I don't even know about because we're not looking at the newspaper. And so if you and I were to go into the administration, maybe Ethiopia, Eritrea, okay, that's in the papers now, but what about something else percolating that we have no idea about, but it's in the intelligence briefings? Right? Again, to be wholly unprepared is not smart.
Yeah. Let me switch a little bit. There's a lot more substance to talk about, but I'm really interested in your personal experience around the decision-making tables of the Defense Department, in particular as a woman. What did you face? What kinds of challenges? I can tell you're not shy, so that isn't an issue. But did you find it difficult to deal with military officers, generals, and others, even despite the fact that your rank as a civilian was right up there with them?
Yeah, it's interesting. I benefited from the fact that when I came to Washington, I already had finished my graduate work. So I had early after college, I worked for the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And then I worked overseas. I went to graduate school at the Fletcher School. I worked overseas again in Bosnia after the war came to an end in the immediate post-war time frame. And then I came down, and then I got my my dissertation work done, everything but the dissertation, and got a job teaching Marines down at Command and Staff College in Quantico. And I learned that just as I learned German and French and Hindi and Russian and other languages along the way, the military and each branch of service has their own language and their own culture. And so I learned how to be a Marine, to stand like this, and and so I became very comfortable with the military. And that was actually the most kind of military of the military, I would argue, the Marine Corps. Very ceremonial, very patriotic. It was the perfect service for me, frankly, because of my background as a child of, refugees, and feeling really grateful to America for everything that I'd been able to achieve in this country. And so when I went up to the Hill and then subsequently to the Pentagon and was dealing then with military officers, military personnel, I had a lot of familiarity. And of course, at the Command and Staff College, we had other officers from other services. I will say, though, that there was always this sense, and especially in the 90s, you walked into a room, and as a professor, I knew my credibility was down like in the basement. You, Brian, would have walked in and they would have been like, man, white hair, okay, you would have started here, right? So it was for me always an uphill climb to prove myself. And I felt that for a long time. And I will say, sometimes even as a 53-year-old woman, every once in a while, I'll have this situation where I'll say, wow, I just really, just spoke to someone, I briefed someone as a female, or, something, whatever I'm doing, I suddenly realize, oh, they were really seeing me as a female, not as a professional. And that happened to me on the Hill, even, within the last decade. And so I think over time, though, it got better. And I'll tell you why. It's mainly because more women have joined, either as civilians or military officers, the defense community. And when I served in the Pentagon in my last job, I was hired by the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Jim Miller. He had been hired by his predecessor, Michelle Flournoy, who's one of the people considered first in line, the person considered first in line to be Secretary of Defense in this incoming administration. And what Michelle and Jim did was hire a lot of smart, I guess, or women, experienced women, to fill senior positions in the policy shop, which is really the most powerful office because it reports directly to the Secretary of Defense and has a lot of sway in the interagency setting. That's basically the office that will go to the NSC meetings in the White House. So I will say it's changed because more women are at the table, but it's not as if there isn't still some implicit bias that you have to deal with, and you do, and not just from men, but also from women. And by the way, I felt that also in the media world, but you asked me specifically about the defense world.
Yeah. Speaking of the policy shop, you must be appalled to see this General Tata, who's now been appointed, who the Congress rejected when he was first recommended by the president. He called Obama a terrorist, I believe, and various other things he said about Muslims and the like. But
well, that kind of person is the epitome of what we would call a political hack. The problem is he's not a political hack, he's a personal hack to Donald Trump. And I can tell you, obviously I'm a Democrat, but I worked on the Hill I had the pleasure of working with Rich Ehrenberg when he was the chief of staff to Carl Levin, who was my boss on the Armed Services Committee. Right. And I worked very closely with Republicans in the Senate on the Armed Services Committee and in the House. And Mark Esper was one of my colleagues. Mark Esper is a solid professional. I may not agree with him on every policy issue, and certainly I don't agree with everything he did as Secretary of Defense, far from it. But I know what his makeup is. I know what his allegiance is, and he's also a former Army officer, but his allegiance is to the Constitution. He was in there trying to do a job for the American people as best as he saw fit. And when it comes to someone like Tata, I don't believe that. I also happen to know James Anderson, interestingly, one of the guys who I think probably resigned in light of the Iran discussion, I think, or Afghanistan. He and I taught together at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College and also went to graduate school together.
What do you imagine is happening? Why would Esper be replaced and all of these people at the top levels of the Defense Department are now loyalists?
Yeah, I think
anything is afoot?
I think there are several things happening. So one is, this is what President Trump does when he's displeased with people. He wants the world to know, he wants them to know. It's his kind of petty acting out. So he had been wanting to get rid of Mark Esper. Obviously, there are some people he listens to, there are some restraints on him, but he decided that he no longer was feeling the restraints when it came to Esper and fired him. The other second thing is, I think he is nervous about, I guess, his legacy, maybe the Russia thing. There have been credible news stories about the new people who came in, and some of them were involved in the trying to cover up the Russian interference, and the Trump campaign and Trump officials who worked with the Russians. So they're even, okay, even though we did not impeach President Trump for it, there was collusion. You just have to read the Mueller report between Russians and the Trump campaign and Trump officials once he was in office. These new people who've gone into the Pentagon, they were arguing, trying to cover this up all along. And so my sense is that perhaps they're trying to get rid of evidence. And then the third thing is, yes, as you said, the president doesn't want to be fettered. So people like Mark Esper sitting at the table saying, no, don't do this. You know, he doesn't want to hear that. He wants yes men and women. And there are things that he clearly would like to do still, like bomb Iran, I guess, you know, that he has to be talked out of, you know, relatively regularly. So I think those are the three motivations for it.
Yeah. You mentioned before that you worked with Vice President Biden, I guess, on the Montenegro accession to NATO. Obviously, Putin was very strongly opposed to that, which some believe was why President Trump, you know, undercut Article 5 as it related to Montenegro. Let me talk a little bit about Russia. The history of NATO expansion. There was an argument that maybe that was a provocation. Clearly, if we look at it in historical terms, it was to some extent. But it was handled very differently in the Clinton administration when they tried to create a partnership for peace with Russia, that they were very careful about how they approached the different countries in Central Europe initially. Then the Bush administration comes in and they abrogate the ABM Treaty, which Russia did not like very much. They basically put intermediate nuclear weapons into Poland and the Czech Republic. They then asked Georgia and Ukraine, which if you look at Russia's historic hegemonic area, was certainly very much a part of that. One argument used by, I suppose, academics is that all of this provoked Russia to begin spending a lot more money on defense and to be a lot more aggressive in terms of its own area. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think historically that this is maybe why Crimea happened? Why there is this aggression in Ukraine, in the Donbass region?
I'm going to try to be brief because I don't know when we have to go to Q&A.
And we've got a few minutes.
We have time? Okay.
20 minutes to go.
Okay, all right, then.
You can be brief though, I don't mind.
Well, what I would say is, okay, first of all, NATO, after the Cold War ended and the wall fell and there was democratization across Eastern Europe, the Eastern Europeans were still nervous about the Russian Federation. Would Russia still want to exert hegemony over them? And they wanted to join NATO as a way of protecting themselves. From the NATO member perspective, that was fine, so long as they did all of the things that are required of NATO members, most importantly, making sure that there's no question about their borders, so no arguments with other nations, other NATO nations about borders, or other nations in general, no internal ethnic conflicts flaring up or active, not being managed properly, and that there was a democracy in place, and that they could contribute militarily. So these are the kind of, roughly speaking, the criteria. The reason NATO members, existing NATO members, decided, well, why not expand east, was that actually what they found was if NATO would expand, it would create more stability, political stability, which would then encourage economic investment, which would then encourage economic development, and it would bolster democracy. So ultimately, NATO expansion, as I see it, and as I think the members at the time saw it, not the ones maybe on the periphery closest to Russia, but certainly, let's say in France or in Denmark. I mean, the idea was that you are spreading stability and security. Essentially, you're deterring Russia or any other actors against taking any action. But frankly speaking, most of the time it was, actors that were within NATO or on the periphery of NATO. And so you're deterring them from taking action against NATO members. That means, again, that your investment in that country is secure. And so it very much helped the economic development of the countries that joined NATO. Russia, as you mentioned, was reassured. And by the way, there was never any agreement, never any guarantee that the George H.W. Bush administration made that NATO wouldn't expand. That's been debunked, but it keeps coming up all the time. They did agree not to put substantial forces on the periphery, and that was part of the agreement that NATO came to with Russia to create a NATO-Russia Council. They talked about maybe someday Russia would join NATO. So it was a very different world in the early days. Of course, Vladimir Putin came on the scene. Initially, he wasn't anti-Russia. He wasn't even anti-missile defense, actually. He spoke, relatively positively about missile defense, even in those early days. But over time, he began to see the United States and NATO as a block on his aspirations. And he essentially decided that what he wanted to do was reinstate the sphere of influence of the former Soviet space, which meant over all of those formerly Soviet republics, including the 3 Balkan countries. And if he could get away with it, a sphere of influence over the East Bloc as well. So the now NATO members like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. So that was the problem, was that Russia started to see things differently. And frankly speaking, the invasion in 2008 into Georgia was the first alarm bell, where we saw Russia using military force to challenge borders. But the first instance of them actually changing borders when they annexed Crimea, the first instance after World War II, happened in 2014. And that happened because Vladimir Putin saw that the Ukrainian people wanted democracy. They did not want his crony in power anymore. We, the United States, the European Union, and the Russians brokered an interim solution, an interim power sharing arrangement. But Yanukovych, who was supported by Moscow, fled. He lost his nerve, of course, because he had killed over 100 Ukrainians. So he knew there was probably some justice coming his way. And ultimately, the Russian government had decided that they didn't want to take any chances with Crimea. So it probably really was a military move when Putin says he didn't want NATO to get Crimea. I think there's some truth there, that he used the excuse, if you will, of the uprising to seize Crimea. They had plans on the books. I mean, that was a lightning operation. We barely had any opportunity to do anything. The Ukrainians were sitting ducks, and the rest, as they say, is history. But we, the international community, did not recognize that annexation. So it's still illegal. The United Nations condemned it. It's still on the books as illegal, and at some point will have to be sorted out, negotiated by Russia and Ukraine.
Right.
And of course, there's another war that the Russians started in another part of Eastern Ukraine.
Right. This is the briefing that President Trump should have received during the transition, the last time we had a transition, I suppose. An excellent briefing, by the way. And but
thank you. But the problem, Brian, if I can interject, is that President Trump got his ear filled, first in St. Petersburg and then in all these phone calls by Vladimir Putin. You correctly, I think, put your finger on it when you said President Trump started talking about Montenegro. President Trump would not have even known about Montenegro had not somebody, whispered something in his ear. It may not have been Putin. It could have been, Flynn or someone else. But in any event, yeah, you're right. He didn't get my briefing.
Yeah, obviously history is going to have a lot of, historians are going to have a lot of fun with this period to figure out what it is that was motivating Trump during these 4 years vis-a-vis Putin. But now I just wonder now, what is it? We clearly need to extend the arms control agreement, the nuclear agreement.
Yeah.
We clearly should be renegotiating the intermediate nuclear range agreement, because that clearly affects Europe and NATO very directly. Do you think the prospects are good for doing that? I mean, I know Putin would like to see an extension of the first, but what about the second? And given the fact that they have, in our terms at least, violated the intermediate range nuclear agreement?
Right. Well, so the first agreement, the New START agreement, which caps the number of strategic missiles that the United States and Russia can have at 5,500, that I think a straightforward extension is something both sides can agree to. I can't speak for the Biden administration. I don't know whether they'll want to achieve something more than that. But frankly, I would advise them to just try to get that, because Putin wants it anyway. The Russians may try to get something else. They always do. I've negotiated with the Russians many times. But ultimately, if we know what our objective is, and we can back up our negotiating position with a willingness to leave the table if we have to, we can achieve what we want. And I think in this case, it shouldn't be that hard. On the other arms control treaties, and there are conventional arms control treaties the Russians have basically cheated on and then withdrew from, the Open Skies Treaty, which then we also subsequently withdrew from under the Trump administration, and same situation with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I mean, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty is tragic because it's the one that, Ronald Reagan came up with in 1986, and it eliminated a whole class of weapons, which were frankly not a threat to us, although they were a threat to our troops in Europe. They were a threat to our allies. And so we extended, we created that agreement, which extended our nuclear umbrella in a nice way across our allies in Europe. Mm-hmm. The reality is it's a little more complicated because we do have a situation with China having now more nuclear weapons, including cruise missiles and the potential for intermediate nuclear weapons there. So the Russians are correct when they say we need to think about a global agreement, but that doesn't mean we can't start with reinstating a treaty between ourselves and the Russians. And I think ultimately what it gets down to is that this Russian government fails to see what I think most historians would understand, most geopoliticians, that Europe and Russia need to stand together, and together with the United States, ideally. That frankly, the challenge that's being posed, the bigger challenge that's being posed towards all of us is coming from China. Now, Russia and China are allied right now because they're autocrats, and the metaphysical struggle, if you will, is between democracy and autocracy. And so the Russians are on that side right now. But if you had another Russian regime that was a little more strategic and far-sighted, they would recognize that perhaps they should be allied with Europe and the United States. And if they couldn't become democratic, at least not antagonize us and attack our democracy. And in that way, they would secure themselves vis-a-vis China also more effectively.
Just have time for, I guess, one more question before, Samantha, you might want to start collecting questions from the audience. I'm sure that this discussion has generated a lot of questions, but the South China Sea, is there a way to deal with China without giving in on the territorial claims that they make because of these islands and the like, so that we can calm down the tension in that particular region?
Yes, there are a couple of things I have to say on that score. So first of all, we're always thinking in terms of what military moves we can make. I mean, the United States. And so when China started building up those islands, I think we said, well, we're going to defend freedom of navigation and we're going to navigate through there. And that's fine. But I don't think we did enough to try to prevent them. And what that means is diplomatically filing cases in international tribunals. I think there's much more we can do to counter what China has done in the South China Sea. It's very dangerous because right now it's about a third, I believe, of the world trade going through that area that China can just close off using missiles or even ships. So it's or the threat of shooting missiles. So it's a dangerous situation for the United States and our allies and partners, and frankly, the world. And so I think if we come together with our allies in Europe, with our allies in Asia, and really all around the world, and tell the Chinese what it is that we want, we can exert enough pressure on them. The Chinese can't operate in the world without some other people cooperating with them. They need to sell things to other countries. And so ultimately they'll have to compromise and they'll have to back down. But right now, what I see is that President Xi has launched a very aggressive, assertive, nationalistic foreign policy, and he hasn't been really held in check. So yes, I mean, you're right that we could do more.
And I think we've got to compete, but compete smartly. It seems to me we can't basically be asking South Korea to pay more for our presence in their country and that kind of thing. We've basically pushed away allies as we deal with China, it seems to me. And then there is the TTP, which I think was a geostrategically smart trade agreement that would have isolated China and at least forced them to stop some of their trade distortions. But anyway, I'm having a hard time, Samantha, seeing the questions.
I see it.
I see Q&A down here. Okay, hold on a second. I think maybe I do have some questions here. Okay. Let me, while I examine these questions.
While you examine, you know what, I'll ask one. So one, Jack Rieger, whom I know, asked about Taiwan and China, and then whether I'd run for office again. So I'll just take those quickly.
Go.
Whether I would run for office again, I don't know. I think, I did it because I felt at that moment the best thing I could do for my district, for my family, for my community, for my country was to hop into the arena and, fight Trump and Trumpism. And I could use all of my experience to fight the COVID pandemic. All the time I spent in the National Security Council Situation Room, to work on the climate crisis, those existential crises. I think it would really depend on the time and whether I felt that that was the best way for me to contribute. But I certainly would like to serve again. I believe strongly in service, and like I said, I'm very grateful to this country. The question about Taiwan, I am worried about Taiwan. I had an opportunity to go there last spring, and we met with the president. She was not yet reelected, but she's since been reelected, and was very firm and very strong on what China was doing in Taiwan, in the region. At the time, we had already the uprising in Hong Kong, and they were watching very closely with concern in Taiwan. So I think we need to really stand with the Taiwanese and give them strength. And also, again, work with other allies around the world to make sure that we are helping the Taiwanese defend their democracy and defend themselves. But I'm very concerned because this Trump administration has done nothing, and not even done nothing, said nothing, at the presidential level when it comes to Hong Kong. And I think that's appalling. I also put some blame on the British government because there was an agreement there and the Chinese broke that agreement. So, and shame on the international community, the United Nations, we need stronger leadership there as well. Which generally comes when the United States is pushing the United Nations to be stronger. So I'm hopeful that that will change as well.
I think it's just a shame what he's done on Hong Kong, because not only have they basically said very little, but they've taken away some of the favorable trade arrangements, which punish the people of Hong Kong for what China basically has done. And then I worry a lot about Taiwan, and I had something to do with the change to Taiwan democracy, which was very impressive. They're a very impressive democracy, and they've switched parties and controlling parties. But I have a
President
question.
Tsai, she's like a very strong woman. She's probably about my age, maybe even younger. She's a professor. She's very self-assured, yet you can imagine the threats on her life, you know.
Yes.
And again, when we saw her was right during the unrest in Hong Kong. And I had also been last spring to Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think a lot of Hong Kongers are going to Taiwan, and some of them are going to England, to the UK, because they've been invited to go there. But that means we leave the city to the Chinese, to the People's Republic. Tom Grover has an interesting question. Once Biden is sworn in, do you think he should increase the US presence in the Middle East and increase the US presence in NATO?
So I think with all due respect to Tom's question, I understand where he's coming from, but I don't think you ask a question. Trump has gotten it in our heads that you just decide to decrease troops, and that's an objective in and of itself. So I think we need to look, what is our objective, you know, in the Middle East? What is our objective in Europe? And does our objective require us to put more troops in, right? And so if what we are doing in Syria right now, the military component of a strategy vis-a-vis Syria and the Middle East, which I'm laughing, smiling, because we don't have one under this administration, as far as I can tell. But a new Biden administration would come in, they would say, this is our objective vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis the Middle East, right? And they would say, this is how we're going to achieve that objective. This is our strategy. And the military component of that strategy hopefully will back up diplomacy so that we have a diplomatic outcome and all of our troops can come home. Or if troops have to remain, as they have done all around the world, they do so in a more peacekeeping, you know, deterrent fashion, right? So that's really the question that we should be asking is, what is the Biden strategy? What's the Biden objective vis-a-vis Syria and the Middle East, vis-a-vis Europe? I would argue in the European context, we probably don't need any more forces there. But, you know, President Trump raised this issue of withdrawing forces from Germany, again, without any political context, except the fact that he doesn't like Chancellor Merkel, you know, which is not a reason to lower the number of forces in Germany. Right. So I would, and the other thing, of course, to bear in mind is places like Germany, where we have bases in Europe, they're not just oriented towards deterrence in Europe, they're also oriented towards allowing our military to function globally, you know, using Europe as kind of a platform. Mm-hmm. The allies don't always like that, but oftentimes they'll go with us and we do consult with them, so.
Right. Stephen Pugh asked a question that's on everyone's mind is, how can any American ally trust us given the results of the last election, which means that our country continues to be totally polarized? Can they trust a Biden that may be replaced in 3 or 4 years, 4 years, presumably, by someone who would be another Trump, or maybe Trump himself?
I mean, look, I think it's an excellent question. Can we trust ourselves? I mean, what are we doing with our democracy? We're not taking very good care of it. So I do think we have to gain trust in one another and in our democracy again. We have to work for it. And same thing goes with the allies. Now, of course, Joe Biden going in there on day one, they know him, they've worked with him, he's kept his word to them. You know, I worked with him in the administration. I know that he had very close relationships with our European allies. So in a way he can pick up there, but not exactly. He has to make up for everything Donald Trump did, every insult to European pride and every insult and weakening of our alliances. That will require work. Mm-hmm.
I see Jan Stockbrugger has asked a number of questions that I think we've already addressed in some part. There's one, will Biden reverse Trump's decision to withdraw from troops in Afghanistan? What will be done on Afghanistan?
Yeah, so again, that gets to the way I answered the other question. I think Biden will go in there and say, okay, first of all, give me a lay of the land. What's the situation in Afghanistan? What's our objective? How are we doing in achieving that objective? And he will not necessarily, I mean, again, the Trump administration, I don't know if they had a strategy with to achieve an objective in Afghanistan. And because bringing the troops home is not a political objective. So if our objective is to get the threat posed by terrorists from Afghanistan to a level that can be managed by the Afghan government with some residual forces, what does that look like? What are those residual forces? So, and I think that is probably that's probably the objective that President Biden will pursue, just because, as we know, under the Obama administration, he was an advocate for, he did not like, if I recall correctly, he opposed the surge and wanted to actually convert the Afghan mission there to really just a counterterrorism mission. So not work on governance. And so my guess is that he would probably still be there, but I don't know. And I think we have to give him a chance and his team a chance to go in there and figure out what is the best approach relative to Afghanistan. Because you have to remember, things have changed in the last 4 years. They're on the border now with Iran, with, as I said, the material for 12 nuclear weapons. But there are interesting things happening internally in Iran, the India-Pakistan situation. So that's all. You also have to think of the region. So I would say, ultimately, it remains to be seen. But I don't think he's going to just accept what Trump does in the last couple of months and be afraid to change it. I think he'll be more thoughtful about it.
I want to ask this question from Maria Isabel Almeida de Sá, which we have a very strong Portuguese community in Rhode Island, as you know. So I just wanted to prove that I could pronounce her name. But what negative impacts of Trump's foreign policy will be the hardest to reverse? You've covered some of that, but
what negative impacts would be the hardest? That's a really good question. I think maybe, I mean, my first thought is, again, these global ones, maybe not so much the pandemic, but the environmental one, because we've lost time. We need to speed up. So that will be hard. As we speak, this Trump administration loosened regulations on air and water quality, on exploration in Anwar, the Arctic refuge in Alaska. I mean, there are many things that he's done to set us back in terms of halting the rising temperature of the earth. So that one might be the hardest one. I mean, I think there are still things we can do. All the scientists say, don't give up. Yes, the earth is going to stay at this, changed higher temperature, but we can mitigate it. We can look at carbon sequestration. We can look at carbon taxes. We can look, really the most important thing is a stimulus that gets us to the renewable energy, renewable green infrastructure. And we need to do that globally as a community, and rejoin, as President-elect Biden said he will do, rejoin the Paris Agreement. But I think that would be the one where I worry the most, that whether we can reverse, because we're going to have to pedal really hard and fast.
I did a webinar earlier today with USAID Alumni Association, where we addressed the issue of how development fits into a future 3D national security strategy. The 3Ds were, of course, originated in the Bush administration, but Obama endorsed them. Trump totally forgot all about it. But when you look at the transnational issues, the climate change issue, the pandemic, the fragile states, which are hemorrhaging refugees, and then the growth of authoritarianism in the world. I think that's my argument anyway, you see a role for development as part of a preventive strategy, this part of the 3D strategy. And I think many military officers would say we need to rebuild diplomacy and rebuild development as well to go along with the defense part of the 3D strategy.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments about that?
Well, I agree 100%. I mean, I think, and this gets to the point I was going to make about human rights, because I can't help but think, when I think about the most horrible thing that this Trump administration has done, the neglect with COVID is one, but the most horrible thing is the fact that as a state, we have created orphans. We have created hundreds of orphans, children who will not be reunited with their families, and families who have lost their children. And that to me is just the most catastrophic, disgusting human rights violation. And we can't undo that. And so when we do democracy and development, we will be confronted with that. And so I think that's another area where we're going to have to show that we want to, as much as possible, make amends, throw light on what happened under the Trump administration, pass laws to make sure it never happens again. We need to outlaw child separation, family separation of detainees, not detainees, of people being held in U.S. custody who are seeking asylum seekers. But diplomacy and development, I mean, I think development is really important because, again, it gets to what Americans like about America and what other people like about America, which is that we don't view things as zero sum. We view it as in our interest to help other countries develop their economy, develop politically, to become more democratic, because we think it's better for the people who live there, which again shows that we are humanitarian spirited, although there's a selfish element of it, which is to say that if there are more stable democracies in the world, we believe in the United States that they'll be our allies and partners and the world will be more stable and secure. So, but that is something that you can only achieve through development and through hard work in countries that goes on for decades. Largely, you know, a lot of times you don't even see the fruits of our labor until much later. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's the impatience of the American people. I mean, we are a very impatient people, and of course, development takes a long time, and it's very hard to explain it. It's less hard today when you consider the threat that we have from global diseases like the COVID-19 disease, the virus, because we actually had, AID had people in Wuhan, China, and all over the world looking at the transfer of pathogens from animals to humans and setting up a warning system, which was, of course, terminated by the Trump administration in 2019, just before we really needed it. It's a shame, but I think it's less difficult to explain to the American people why we need to invest, not just alone, but with other donors. The United States has always been a leader in this area. So,
right, and same goes for countering terrorism. You know, the roots of terrorism have
right.
to do with haves and have-nots and group dynamics, and if we can address the economic conditions or the political conditions that lead to that kind of violent political movement, then we have a leg up. But that does take time and effort and investment of relatively small resources, frankly speaking, relative to other parts of our government.
Well, the challenge is going to be on the pandemic is distributing the vaccine equitably. Mm-hmm. And that means not just to Americans. So obviously that we have to worry about the welfare of our own people first. But if we don't deal with this in other countries, particularly developing countries, it's going to come right back at us. And
literally, yeah.
Literally.
And again, there, I think we have a moral obligation. The world has a moral obligation to, you know, apply the right standards across the board in making the vaccines available and affordable.
Yeah. Christopher Garrity wants to know, which ally do you think is most underrated for the United States? An interesting question.
That is really
the most underrated.
Underrated. So underestimated by the American people?
Yeah, I suppose by the experts at the Defense Department. Which would you think they would find is the most underrated ally and the most important one that isn't recognized as such? I think that's what you're getting.
Yeah, they kind of stopped me in my tracks. I mean, there are some small, you know, consequential states. I thought of Japan. That popped into my head immediately because I think the Japanese, you know, they don't always get credit for their steadfastness, including, of course, they don't have much of a choice, but still, I mean, look at the Philippines. I mean, they kind of decided, oh, well, you know, we're just going to go, you know, join China. I mean, not the entire country, but their government under Duterte, who of course is a Trumpian, kind of populist, neo-fascist type figure himself.
Right.
So, but I would say, I mean, I think the Japanese, they're always there for us. And maybe the best example I can give was, I remember going to a NATO summit and staffing Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, and he was going to give his remarks, and we had all contributed to his, a couple of us contributed to his remarks. And I sat behind him, and I had these cards because I knew he was going to turn around and ask me. He said, the Japanese, because we had in there, you have to thank the Japanese for helping Ukraine with all of their development assistance. Nobody knew the Japanese were in there with us trying to help the Ukrainians defend their democracy, not by providing munitions, but they were doing other things in there. They had their development agency in there. And so, and I had these backup cards with all the data. What were the Japanese doing and how much were they spending? And, so I would give the prize to the Japanese.
I think that's a good choice. And of course, they have this constitutional provision which says they can only have a defense force, but they're actually debating that issue now because they feel more threatened. And they can obviously rationalize what that means by expanding their defense force, but it is worrisome to other countries in the region because it's not that long ago that they were very expansive.
I think the problem there is, and by the way, the Japanese people have not supported outgoing Prime Minister Abe's, push for amending Article 9 and amending the Constitution, their Constitution, so that they can have a military force. That it's the sentiment among the Japanese people is too strongly anti-military. Having said that, Abe and the military and the political leadership, they have found ways to build their defensive capability and to work with us in kind of offensive situations and to kind of push the envelope farther, stretch it a bit. But I would say that part of the problem does, from the international perspective, as you said, does lie in the fact that the Japanese leadership somehow still manages to fall short of reassuring their allies about not their intent, but really about the past and whether they are, so nationalistic as to be racist or not. Like, that question is still too much in the minds of the Koreans and others in the region. And so I think that is a problem for the Japanese, frankly speaking, an international political problem that they could do a better job addressing.
Sam Erdank has a question that's been lingering there, and I think you probably answered it, what the most debilitating problems that came out of the Trump administration. I want to invert that and ask you to tell me what you think good happened in the last 4 years.
Well, but I do want to answer his question, because I think Maria's question was more about what's the lasting thing that'll be hardest for us to address, right? And I said the climate crisis. But Sam's asking what's the most debilitating and dangerous? And I think it's the kowtowing to the authoritarians. Because as I mentioned at the outset, what we are in right now is an existential struggle between democracy and autocracy. And this president, even though his cabinet and Congress didn't agree with him and they didn't take the side of Vladimir Putin overtly the way he has, or of Kim Jong-un the way he has, or of other dictators, or autocrats, the reality is that President Trump has. And so he's emboldened Putin. And he himself has become emboldened by the fact that our democracy wasn't strong enough, that we didn't stand up to him enough, because it wasn't enough that he had the Russians interfere and essentially help him get elected into 2016. But then he went out, reached out to try to get the Ukrainian president to get involved in getting him reelected by making up dirt on Vice President Biden, at the time Vice President Biden. And President Trump failed, but he was caught red-handed, and that's why he was impeached by the House of Representatives. The Senate, of course, didn't didn't find him guilty, which is why, of course, he's continued to side with Putin and do all kinds of other things that are detrimental to us. So I think that's the most detrimental thing. In terms of what's good, I agreed, and I continue to think it was a good idea to strike Syria after they used chemical weapons against their citizens in April of 2018, I believe it was, because not only because it was punishing the Syrians for what they did, which was a human rights violation. Of course, they had been using bleach and other chlorine, other weapons against and against innocent civilians in Syria. It's not to say that that was necessarily worse, but it was important to stand up and say, you cannot use chemical weapons against your citizens, against innocent citizens, to reinforce that taboo. So I think that was something that I applaud. Another thing I applaud is the provision of lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine. It was something that I argued for when I was in the Obama administration unsuccessfully. And President Trump's team went to him and amazingly got him to sign on and to agree to it. The reason, it didn't cause, it kind of disappeared from the radar because as myself and my colleagues who were arguing for it suspected, it wasn't, or knew, it wasn't going to change the military balance between Ukraine and Russia. So it wasn't going to create an escalation. And in fact, it would provide a deterrent to Ukraine. Other than that, I would say, I know there are people who want to say moving the embassy to Jerusalem and Israel, recognizing that Israel has possession of the Golan Heights, that somehow was good. I would argue that it's not good because President Trump did it unilaterally, and he did it in a way that actually put Israel in greater danger. Because when you make decisions like that, we, the United States, have always worked with the international community to bring, especially the Europeans and the United Nations, bring the bulk of the international community along with us, so that decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem or to recognize that, Israel essentially controls the Golan Heights is something that is also stamped with a stamp of approval, that is also regarded as legitimate and acceptable by the international community, not just by the United States. So I think those types of actions, while some people would say made Israel stronger, I don't believe they made Israel stronger. And also all of the actions that he took vis-a-vis the Palestinians, taking the aid away from the Palestinians, only created more anger, and I think made it harder ultimately for us to come up with a lasting solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which has to involve two states. And so I think that's an area where I just have to mention it because someone might think that it was a good thing, but I think it was reckless because it wasn't done the right way.
I think actually the stage is set for the Biden administration if they want to get back. I think they'll have to wait till Netanyahu leaves the scene and Gantz comes into power, but there's a possibility for a two-state solution eventually. And maybe even some of the mistakes that have been made will actually support more diplomacy in that area, in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, you can only hope that, the sum total of your mistakes somehow along the line then create a fertile ground for getting it right in the next round, which is kind of the way our democracy is too, let's face it, right? We've made mistakes throughout our history. And I feel, again, obviously I have my slant on this, but I feel that this new election is a chance for us to kind of reset. And frankly, I think it's a bipartisan reset. There are so many Republicans who agree, who voted for Biden or who didn't, but I think many people agree.
I actually, and you've worked in the Senate as I have and as Rich has, I think there are a lot of Republicans that are breathing a sigh of relief, even though they're not saying anything openly at this point. But I think they know Joe Biden. I think they can work with him and maybe we can get some things done. Certainly in the national security area. I don't know about domestic policy, but in the national security, foreign policy area, I think there's a lot that can be done.
I also think in domestic politics, one question I would have is what's happening on the ground in Texas, for example, or in the border states as they become more blue, if you will, it might present an opportunity to make some progress on immigration reform. I mean, there are areas where there is agreement, bipartisan agreement. There just hasn't been movement because, I don't know, it's a political football and it raises money and it's talking points.
What we do domestically has a lot to do with whether we're going to have leverage in foreign policy and diplomacy as well. And immigration is one issue we have to take on. We have to do something about climate change, otherwise we'll have no credibility in dealing with it overseas. And we obviously need to take on the race issues that have been raised so explicitly in this last couple of years.
And I would say, Brian, if I could add, you know, I basically lost my race, and I'm glad to say, in a way, I mean, it sounds funny, one of the most beautiful things to come out of this past year, and this past year there was very little that was beautiful, was the Black Lives Matter movement becoming mainstream. You know, that you had people of all races and ages and genders and everything all over America saying, you know what, we get it. There's a problem here and it's systemic and we need to address it. And racism is real. It didn't go away because we elected a Black president. So I think that to me is something that's real, and I feel it has changed. I don't think it's just a surface thing. I really do believe that people are more committed to making change. Let's see if our lawmakers can do that at all levels. But that's what I feel the opportunity is right now.
We have, I think, just time for one more question, and I want to say something too at the end, but Alberto Bertoni has asked about Yemen. What do you think? It's a terrible humanitarian disaster. Can we stop the Saudis from doing what they're doing? How do we deal with the Houthis and their Iranian partners?
Well, I'm pretty sure that both Biden and Harris have been on the record saying they are opposed to US military involvement in Yemen. And so to the extent that we are still supporting the Saudis, they will, I expect, pull back from that. And that is a bipartisan objective also of the committees of jurisdiction on the Hill. So I do think that our support to the Saudis for this horrible war in Yemen will come to a close. The relationship with Saudi Arabia will be interesting because, of course, this Trump administration has skewed their again, I mentioned instability in the Middle East has been increased by Trump in part because of their skewed allegiance or alliance or whatever you want to call it, friendship with Saudi Arabia, and in particular, the murderous crown prince. And that then, of course, that cozying up was coupled with the, you know, perversely confrontational but ineffective stance vis-a-vis Iran. And so all of that needs to be re-examined by the Biden administration coming in, and they need to really be more professional. This, I feel that a lot of the Trump administration policy in the Middle East was very emotional and it did not keep US interests at the forefront. So we need a better balanced policy. And so my hope is that will extend throughout the region.
You say it's emotional. I think there might have been something to do with the Trump
money
corporation's wallet. Yes, that's why Jared has been so active in the Middle East, I suspect. But
well, maybe I should say they're emotional about money. You know, some people
very
are.
Good. Well, I want to just say one final thing before I turn it over to Rich, and that is I want to address your parents.
They don't have a camera or they probably can't chat, but yeah.
I'm sure that they are really impressive people, but they know how good you are, but you've just demonstrated it today, and they should feel very, very proud of what you've accomplished and how articulate you are about these issues. And I welcome, I'm delighted that they're here and that they've produced a real leader, a real American leader. As I've watched the various experts on the pandemic come on the air, I would say 75% of them happen to be immigrants and more recent immigrants.
Yeah.
And they're very impressive, and we need more of them in this country, not less. So I'll end there by thanking your parents for bringing you here. And giving,
well, I was born here, but yes.
I know. Well, okay. You wouldn't have been born here if they didn't come here. So, Rich, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you for saying that. And if I could just say very quickly, this is why I think fundamentally I decided, okay, I can run for office, because I really have such a strong belief. All of us here in America, we're, with the exception of Blacks who were brought here because of slavery, came here trying to make this a better country. And then once the Blacks got their freedom, they also obviously have been contributing to making this country better. And the thing about America that I think is so beautiful is that we have a civic nationalism. It's not ethnic. It's not based on your religion, your race, anything, your whatever, who your parents were. It's based on your adherence to our civic values, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, all of these things that are now under attack. And that to me is what makes America really special. I've lived in countries all over the world. I've traveled to over 80 countries. And I really do believe, I don't believe we're so special that we're above everyone else, but I believe that we are special because we do learn and we do try to be better. And I think we had a long early history where we didn't try to be better. I've been reading American history. these horrible presidents in the past too. But really, since I would say FDR, certainly when we started to create sort of a safety net, we really tried to make America a better country. And so I think with this, we had a really horrible 4 years, and of course a treacherous, horrible, tragic year this past year, but we have an opportunity to make America better, build it back better.
Well said. Well said.
What a terrific way to wrap up. I want to thank Brian Atwood for a terrific job as a moderator. And I want to thank our guest, Evelyn Farkas, for what was really a tour de force, really fascinating program.